The parents of a young University of Victoria student are pushing for answers and for change after their daughter suffered a fatal overdose in a university residence. There are concerns about how the 911 call was handled, as well as how long it took to administer potentially life-saving naloxone. I'm Dave Breckenridge, and this is 10-3. Vancouver Sun reporter Laurie Culbert joins me to discuss the series of events around the student's death, why her parents are convinced there were gaps in the system that ultimately failed their daughter, and how the university and the provincial government have responded. Don't forget you can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google, Amazon Music. I'd love it if you could leave us a rating, a review, and tell your friends about the show. So Laurie, you recently had a pretty alarming, sad, heartbreaking story about a student at the University of Victoria. And before we get into some of the details of this case, just first tell me who Cindy McIntyre Starko was.
So Sydney was 18. She was a really diligent student. She was studying science at the University of Victoria. She was a very accomplished dancer, spent her high school years performing and competing in dance. She was very artistic. She was very musical. She was a singer. But, just generally, she was an all-around lovely young woman who was, part of the studious crowd at her high school. And I should just be completely honest with your listeners. I'm also related to her by marriage. Her mother is my husband's first cousin. So I had the honor of knowing Sydney since the day she was born.
Mm-hmm. And what happened to her on the night of January 23rd?
So we don't know all of the answers, but we know a lot of the answers now. We know that she went to a residence to visit a high school friend, that the high school friend told her roommate that the two of them were going to watch a movie together in the student lounge area. And that the next thing we know is that the roommate and several other students saw these two girls, both Sydney and her friend Leah, collapse on the floor. And they immediately called for help.
Mm-hmm. And we will talk about kind of the events that unfolded after the call for help shortly. But as we know, they called for help. She was ultimately taken to hospital and declared brain dead there. When did she die?
So these events happened on January the 23rd. She was declared brain dead several days later in hospital, and then her life officially ended on January the 29th when her organs were harvested for donation.
I can imagine in the chaos that followed, after she was taken to hospital, there's parental notification or trying to reach out to family. What were her parents and her brother able to glean about what happened to her in the immediate aftermath?
In the immediate 12 to 24 hours, they did not learn very much. Thankfully, a friend on the residence hall had a phone number for Sydney's brother. And so that friend called Sydney's brother and said, "Your sister's just been taken to the hospital." And he was able to then contact his parents. Uh, it was too late for her parents, who live in Vancouver, to catch a ferry or a plane to get to her bedside. They couldn't get there until the next morning. But Sydney's mother is an emergency room physician, and she knows very well that overdoses can be easily reversed with the overdose reversing medication called naloxone, or its brand name is Narcan. Or even if bystanders give first aid, give rescue breathing, that hundreds of thousands of overdoses are reversed every year in the province of British Columbia alone. And so they had information from some of the students that there were first responders that came and that their daughter got CPR, that their daughter got naloxone, and they had some comfort in thinking that she was going to be okay. And that was until they got to Victoria the next day.
Yeah, and as you mentioned in your story, her mom, when she arrived in Victoria from Vancouver and got to hospital, felt something was amiss. What triggered her suspicion?
Well, her daughter was non responsive. Her daughter did not appear to have brain activity. Um, it became clear to Dr. Caroline McIntyre that her daughter wasn't responding to any of the help that was being given to her in the ICU and the hospital. And what that meant to her was that Sydney's brain must have been starved of oxygen for far too long. She wasn't responding to any of the medical interventions in the hospital to bring her back. And that, of course, raised the very important question of if first aid had been delivered promptly, if naloxone had been delivered promptly, why had her brain been starved of oxygen for so long?
And her parents then decided that they wanted some answers, right? Like what steps did they take to try and get information from the university, from uh, BC health officials, from the fire department? Like what route did they take to try and sort out what happened to their daughter?
I'm going to answer your question, but I just want to pause here and say all of the efforts that they made were while they were dealing with unimaginable grief. I mean, I have spent a lot of time in my career interviewing parents who have lost children. None of those parents, it's not an easy road for any of them. But I just want to answer your question with the backdrop that these are devastated parents who are just, overwhelmed with the grief of losing their daughter. They reach out and they do get some documents from, the fire department and the police department. But initially, their queries were denied by the University of Victoria and by the BC Ambulance Service in their efforts to try to find out exactly what time aid was administered to their daughter that night.
And so did they have to resort to the freedom of information system to try and get more details about what happened to Sydney?
They did. They filed freedom of information documents. They had meetings with all sorts of officials from the university, from the ambulance service, and they eventually were able to get audio recordings of the two emergency calls that were made that night. So, just to back up a little bit, students, first year students at the University of Victoria are told to phone campus security for any emergencies on campus. So they knew that the students had phoned both campus security and they knew that the students had phoned 911. So through their efforts, they eventually received audio recordings of both the phone call to campus security and the phone call to 911.
And when we break down what happened next, like what do the documents that they get, what are the freedom of information requests that they make? What does that yield for them? Do we get kind of a breakdown of who showed up when, or what the campus security were being told? Like how did this all transpire?
So campus security arrived within 3.5 minutes. The two officers were carrying naloxone and were trained in first aid. 911 was on the phone with another student. And yet there was significant delays in aid being offered to these students. And I should say that the student witnesses, and I've spoken with several of them, describe both Sydney and Leah as being blue. And a body turns blue when it's struggling to bring in oxygen, when there's a significant lack of oxygen. They are unconscious, they're unresponsive, and in particular on the 911 call, you can hear Leah about every 30 seconds making these very loud, startling gaps for breath out loud as she is clearly struggling to breathe. Sydney is quiet. in the background.
When we look at how all of this transpired, when we look at, when campus security arrived at scene, I imagine an ambulance was called and we had paramedics or firefighters showing up at the scene. What's the timeline here? And I guess how does it match with what the information the university has been giving to Sydney's family, Leah's family, and even to you as a journalist reporting on this story?
Yeah, so, in Canada, journalists don't get access to 911 calls very often. The fact that the parents could access this call is the only reason that we can illustrate the failed medical response in this case. Without access to this 911 call, we would never have been able to challenge the version of events that the University of Victoria provided to us when we went to them asking questions. UVic insisted that naloxone was administered within 7 minutes of the student witnesses calling for help. Now, experts say 7 minutes is on the extreme outside of saving someone in an overdose, but it is still possible to save them within 7 minutes. But the 911 recording clearly shows it was 13 minutes before naloxone was administered. Again, UVic insisted to us that chest compressions were started at about the 10-minute mark of the emergency phone call, when the 911 call clearly shows it was more than 15 minutes.
We'll be right back. What is the role of the 911 operator here? And what is the role of campus security? Are campus security officers trained to administer naloxone? Do they have to take guidance from a 911 operator in a case like this? What is kind of involved in that interplay between agencies?
So the campus security officers did receive training and were carrying naloxone. They do have level 2 first aid training. They were in the room. They were the ones who could see the distress that Sydney and Leah were under. The 911 operator was on the phone, unfortunately, with a student who was impaired. And so there is a sense in the phone call and also from the other student witnesses in the room that important information wasn't being shared back and forth with the 911 call taker. And unfortunately, that 911 call taker didn't ask to speak with the security guards until she'd been on the phone with this impaired student for 8.5 minutes. And so during those first crucial minutes after the students called for help, there was no communication back and forth between the 911 caller and the security guards. And so the security guards on their own, instead of delivering the naloxone or the chest compressions right away, they were asking the students questions about, had someone taken drugs? Do we know what drugs were taken? When quite frankly, none of those questions needed to be asked, because we know with naloxone that even if there's a suspicion of an overdose, naloxone does not harm someone if it's used, even if that person isn't overdosing. It has no harmful effects. In the meantime, the 911 call taker was asking the impaired student a series of questions. Is it possible that both students were pregnant? Is it possible that both students were epileptic? Is it possible that both students are diabetic? She didn't get to asking about, is it possible that drugs were involved, until 11 minutes into the emergency phone call, which to me is mind-boggling when we have 2 students down in a dorm room in the midst of a toxic drug crisis that in this province is killing 6 to 7 people a day. Finally, when the 911 call taker asked the impaired student to, pass the phone over to the security guards, and this is at minute 8.5 of the phone call, even at that point, she says to the guards, have you found out if the kids have taken drugs? and they say, we're not sure. And she says, well, leave your phone with the patients. This is the unconscious blue girls. Leave your phone with the patients and go ask their friends what happened. Finally, at that point, one of the girls in the room, in fact, the girl on the phone who had been on the phone with 911, admitted that they may have taken drugs. And it was only then, at the 13-minute mark, that the 911 call taker said to the security guards, you better deliver naloxone. And when it became clear that Sydney wasn't responding at the 15-minute mark, she said to them, you better start chest compressions.
Yeah. What has the university had to say amid all of this? I know campus security is only a piece of this. Is there, as you just outlined, there are potential issues with the 911 call that is not the university's purview. But what has the university had to say about this to the parents, to you in media, and also just even to the students in general?
So it's been complicated. I have not been granted an interview with anyone at the university, despite asking for a long time now. I've received written statements from the university. Sydney's parents have had a meeting with the university officials, including the president of the university, Kevin Hall. At the end of the day, in response to Sydney's case, the university did change its policy and has now made it mandatory that when emergency phone calls come in to campus security, that campus security has to immediately phone 911 themselves, so that there's never going to be another situation in the future where there's a student on the line with 911 rather than one of the security guards. They have promised to make some changes to first-year student orientation in the fall, around, warnings and information about the toxic drug crisis. However, the really major changes, such as widespread availability of naloxone on campus for students, they have not agreed to. They continue to defend their security officers and their action that night. They are continuing to insist that the security officers did everything they could that night. So it has been frustrating, and I know it's been frustrating for Sydney's parents, that about this kind of lack of response from the university.
Mm-hmm. And because we're dealing with two provincial bodies, we're dealing with the University of Victoria. We're also dealing with BC Ambulance Service. What has the provincial government said in response? Are they planning on taking any action? Are they planning on reviewing the case? What have they had to say for themselves?
So I'll answer the BC Ambulance question first. And Sydney's mother, Dr. Carolyn McIntyre, has filed a complaint with the body that oversees complaints regarding 911 calls, and so that review is underway. And when I spoke with the BC Ambulance folks, they insisted again that their 911 call taker didn't do anything wrong in this case. They insist that because the student caller described Sydney and Leah as seizing when she phoned, that the 911 call taker was following her protocols for a call involving two girls who were seizing, and that those protocols didn't lead her to questioning about drugs until 11 minutes later. That's under review, and we're waiting the outcome of that review. When it comes to the provincial government, Dave, from your years in journalism, governments don't typically act quickly, right? They take time to study things and strike committees, and they don't often respond quickly. In this case, there was a very, very fast response from the BC NDP government here in British Columbia. 3 hours after our story was published on Thursday, the Premier, David Eby, stood up in the provincial legislature and called the sequence of events in Sydney's death profoundly disturbing. Those are his words, and announced that there would be a coroner's inquest into her case. That brought a real silver lining for her parents, because they had been, demanding a coroner's inquest. And the province since then, on the weekend, just days later, the Minister of Mental Health and Addictions announced that the province would make changes to have better oversight of medical first response and naloxone availability on campuses. The province is also committed to meeting other demands of Sydney's parents, which include mandatory CPR training in high schools, so that when youth get to university, they know the basics of doing CPR. And I should note that in other provinces like Ontario, CPR is already mandatory in high school curriculum, but it's not here in British Columbia. The province has also agreed on the weekend to start to bring nasal naloxone to British Columbia, rather than the very archaic needle naloxone that we have available here. And nasal naloxone is also widely available in other provinces, but not in British Columbia. And that's important, because if you're not someone who's accustomed to using needles and you're in the middle of an emergency, it can be very intimidating to open a kit, crack open a glass vial, draw up liquid naloxone and then into a syringe and then stab someone with a needle. By bringing in nasal naloxone, it's as simple as unscrewing the cap on a squirt bottle and squirting it up someone's nose. So those are significant changes. I mean, the province has promised to bring them in. We'll be monitoring and watching and making sure that that happens. And then just finally on Tuesday, the Minister of Post-Secondary, she called a meeting with the 25 presidents and vice presidents of the universities and colleges across British Columbia to have a meeting with them to find out what's happening on their campuses with medical first response, with overdose response, and with naloxone availability. So again, a silver lining for Sydney's parents that there has been a tremendous response to this story.
Yeah, I can imagine that at least gives some solace even amid the tragedy. Are there still unanswered questions on the part of Cindy's parents? Are there still issues that they feel haven't been addressed, or still outstanding questions for them about how this was all handled?
Well, yeah, I mean, if you ask them, they would tell you they had a list of 100 questions that haven't been answered. I think they're certainly hoping that between the coroner's inquest and the review being done by the ambulance service, that some of those will be answered. I know that they would like more answers from the University of Victoria around, why there wasn't an investigation earlier into this death. I mean, Sydney collapsed on January the 23rd. I mean, it's laudable that that officials are responding now to this case, but we're in late May, and they want to know why there wasn't immediate action right away. I mean, we don't know through coroner statistics how many post-secondary students overdose on post-secondary campuses. It's a statistic that I've requested from the coroner service, but their point is, how many can there be? And if in their case the overdose was fatal, why wasn't there a response right away from both the university and from the ministry that oversees universities? Why wasn't it enough when Sydney died in January for all these investigations and actions to take place? Why was it necessary for a grieving family to have to do this legwork and then reach out to a reporter, and for me to write this heartbreaking story before any action was taken?
Yeah, and it is unquestionably a heartbreaking story, and hopefully there can potentially be some change out of what is certainly a tragedy, if not for the family, but for the water community as a whole. Lori, thanks for your time.
Thanks for having me, Dave. It's really an important story, and I'm so happy that you asked me to speak about it.
10-3 is produced by Sean Knox. Theme music by Bryce Hall. Thanks to my guest Lori Culbert. More from her at vancouversun.com. I'm Dave Breckenridge. Thanks for listening.